You have Dolby Atmos speakers in your room right now, and they're doing almost nothing. The height channels that were supposed to make rain fall from above you, helicopters fly over your head, and music surrounds you from every direction are sitting there producing sound, but not the sound they were designed to produce. The reason isn't bad speakers. The reason isn't a weak receiver. The reason is 5 specific settings that the vast majority of Atmos owners have either never touched or have configured incorrectly. And every one of them is quietly preventing the overhead layer of your audio from working the way it should. Today I'm going to walk through all 5, show you exactly where to find them, and explain what changes the moment you fix them. Subscribe and drop a like before we get into this. And tell me in the comments what your current Atmos setup looks like, whether you're running a soundbar with up-firing drivers, a full AV receiver with ceiling speakers, or anything in between, and what you've noticed about your overhead sounds so far. Let's fix this properly. What Dolby Atmos actually needs to work, before we go through each setting, it helps to understand what Atmos is actually doing. Because once you see the complete picture, each of these 5 mistakes becomes immediately obvious. Traditional surround sound works with fixed channels. Left, right, center, left surround, right surround, subwoofer. Every speaker has a specific channel assigned to it, and the audio mix is written specifically for those positions. Dolby Atmos is fundamentally different because it uses audio objects instead of fixed channels. A sound designer can place a sound anywhere in 3-dimensional space, and the Atmos renderer inside your receiver calculates in real time which combination of your specific speakers should reproduce that object based on exactly where those speakers are located. This is why Atmos can sound different and correct in a 5-speaker room versus a 12-speaker room with the same source material. The renderer adapts to whatever speaker configuration you have. But here's the critical implication. For that rendering to work correctly, every step in the chain has to be set up right. Your source has to actually be sending Atmos data rather than a downgraded format. Your receiver has to know your correct speaker layout. Your height speakers have to be declared as the right type in the right positions. The distances and levels have to be accurate so sound arrives coherently from all directions. And the listening mode has to be one that actually uses the Atmos object metadata rather than collapsing it. Get any one of these wrong, and your overhead speakers either sit silent, produce vague, unfocused sound, or simply blend into the surround channels without delivering any real sense of height. Setting 1. Turn on real Atmos bitstream from your TV or streaming device. The first setting is the most fundamental, because if this one is wrong, nothing else you configure matters. Your height speakers can be perfectly placed, perfectly calibrated, and perfectly declared in your receiver. But if the signal being sent to your receiver isn't actually Atmos data, those speakers will never receive the overhead information they need. This setting lives in your TV or streaming device, not in your receiver, which is why so many people miss it. The issue is that most TVs default to outputting PCM audio, which stands for pulse code modulation. PCM is a standard digital audio format that works perfectly well for basic stereo or simple surround. But when your TV receives an Atmos soundtrack from a streaming app and then converts it to PCM before sending it to your receiver, the Atmos spatial information is completely stripped out. Your receiver gets a standard 2-channel or 5, one signal with no height data, no object positioning, and no overhead layer. Your height speakers receive nothing meaningful, and the entire Atmos experience that was encoded in the source content never makes it past your television's audio processing. The fix is to go into your TV's audio settings, find the option labeled Digital Audio Output or Audio Format, and change it from PCM to bitstream, auto, or passthrough. The exact name varies by brand. Samsung often calls it bitstream. LG uses passthrough. Sony uses auto. What you're doing is telling your TV to stop converting the incoming audio and instead pass the original encoded signal directly to your receiver, where the proper decoding and Atmos rendering can actually happen. While you're in those settings, also look for any specific Dolby Atmos pass-through toggle, because some TVs have a separate switch for this that needs to be enabled alongside the general output format change. If you're using a dedicated streaming device like an Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV Stick, or NVIDIA Shield rather than your TV's built-in apps, The same principle applies, but the setting is in the streaming device's audio output menu rather than the TV's. On Apple TV, go to Settings, Video and Audio, then Audio Format, and make sure Dolby Atmos is enabled with Change Format set to Auto. On Fire TV, go to Settings, Display and Sounds, Audio, Dolby Atmos, and turn it on. On the NVIDIA Shield, make sure the audio output is set to Auto for the highest quality format. Until you send a true Atmos bitstream over HDMI, your Height speakers are essentially decorative, no matter how much money you spent on them or how carefully you position them. Setting 2. Tell your receiver the correct speaker layout. The second setting that destroys Atmos for most people without them realizing it is the speaker layout configuration in the receiver itself. This is where you tell your receiver exactly how many speakers you have and how they're arranged, and if this information is wrong. The Atmos renderer has an inaccurate picture of your speaker system and cannot place audio objects correctly in three-dimensional space. Here's what the layout notation actually means. When you see a configuration like 5.1.2 or 7.1.4, the first number is the count of your ear-level speakers, the middle number after the decimal point is your subwoofers, and the last number after the second decimal is your overhead or height channels. So a 5.1.2 system has 5 ear-level speakers, 1 subwoofer, and 2 height channels. A 7.1.4 system has 7 ear-level speakers, 1 subwoofer, and 4 height channels. If your receiver's speaker configuration menu shows 5, 1 when you actually have 2 up-firing drivers or 2 ceiling speakers adding height channels, the receiver doesn't know those height speakers exist. It treats them as unused amplifier channels or simply doesn't map any audio objects to them. The Atmos renderer then folds all overhead object audio into your existing ear-level speakers, and everything collapses into a flat, two-dimensional soundstage regardless of how many speakers you physically have in the room. Go into your receiver's speaker configuration or setup menu and find where you declare your speaker layout. This might be labeled speaker config, speaker setup, amp assign, or something similar depending on your receiver brand. Update it to accurately reflect your actual configuration, including the correct number of overhead channels. The moment you tell the receiver you have a 5.1.2 or 7.1.4 layout, it changes how the Atmos renderer works, activating the overhead processing and mapping audio objects to your height speakers for the first time. If you've been running your system in 5.1 mode while having up firing speakers installed, fixing this single setting will produce an immediately noticeable change in how sound moves around and above you. Atmos is not just a logo, it is a layout. If your receiver thinks you're running 5.1, your ceiling or up-firing speakers will never do what they were built to do. Setting 3. Map your height speakers correctly. The third setting is closely related to the second, but more specific. And it's one that even people who have correctly declared their speaker count often get wrong. Within your receiver's speaker configuration, you need to tell it not just that you have height speakers, but exactly what type of height speakers they are and where they're positioned relative to your listening area. This type declaration is what the Atmos renderer uses to understand the geometry of your speaker system. And if you tell it the wrong type, the rendering math will be based on a speaker position that doesn't match reality. The categories that matter most are in ceiling speakers, up-firing Atmos-enabled modules, and height speakers mounted high on walls. In ceiling speakers that are physically installed in the ceiling above your listening position should be declared as top front, top middle, or top rear, depending on whether they're located in front of, directly above, or behind your main seating area. Up-firing Atmos modules, those add-on speakers that sit on top of your main floor standing or bookshelf speakers and bounce sound off the ceiling, need to be declared as Dolby enabled speaker or Dolby Atmos enabled, not as front height or top front. The reason this distinction matters is significant. Dolby enabled speaker declarations tell the renderer to account for the ceiling reflection path in its calculations, while top front or similar designations assume a direct overhead path. If you set up firing modules as front height, the renderer calculates the audio based on a direct sound path that doesn't exist in your setup, and the spatial imaging becomes vague, directionally confused, and far less convincing than it should be. The positioning of height speakers also matters physically, not just in the settings. Overhead speakers work best when they're placed roughly above or slightly in front of and behind your main listening position, not mounted near the front wall above the TV where they effectively become elevated front speakers rather than true overhead sources. Dolby recommends height speakers positioned at approximately 45 degrees from your main listening position for both front and rear height pairs in a 4-height channel setup. If your speakers are significantly off this geometry, consider whether repositioning them is possible, because even perfect settings can't fully compensate for dramatically wrong physical placement. After any changes to how you've declared your height speakers in the receiver, rerun your receiver's speaker mapping wizard to ensure everything is correctly recognized in the updated configuration. Setting 4. Fix distances and levels for height channels. The 4th setting is where even people who've gotten the first 3 correct often lose a significant portion of their overhead effect. And it comes down to the accuracy of the distance and level calibration for your height channel specifically. Auto calibration systems like Odyssey, Yepao, and Dirac are excellent tools, but they frequently miscalculate the distances to ceiling or up-firing height speakers because the microphone's angle and position makes accurately capturing reflections from overhead sources more challenging than capturing direct sound from ear-level speakers. Distance matters because your receiver uses it to calculate time delay for each speaker, ensuring that sound from all speakers arrives at your ears at precisely the same moment. If your receiver thinks your ceiling speakers are 8 meters away when they're actually 2.5 meters away, it introduces a delay that's significantly longer than reality, causing overhead audio objects to arrive later than the rest of the sound field. What you hear is a smearing or misalignment of the overhead layer, where sounds that should feel like a unified spatial event instead feel disconnected, with the height information arriving slightly behind the rest of the mix. This destroys the seamless 3-dimensional imaging that makes Atmos genuinely convincing. Level calibration is equally important and even more frequently wrong. Auto calibration systems tend to set height channels conservatively, often leaving them 2 to 4 decibels quieter than optimal for clear overhead imaging. When height channels are too quiet, the overhead layer of Atmos becomes subtle to the point of being almost imperceptible. You know intellectually that sound is coming from above, but you don't feel it. It doesn't create the visceral sense of spatial depth that demonstrates what Atmos actually is at its best. The fix involves going into your receiver's speaker distance and level settings and manually verifying the numbers against your actual measurements. Take a tape measure and physically measure the distance from your main listening position to each height speaker, including following the actual sound path for up-firing modules, which involves measuring to the ceiling reflection point rather than directly to the speaker. Enter these measured distances and override whatever the auto-calibration calculated if the numbers are significantly different. For levels, play an Atmos test track with strong overhead content and raise your height channel levels by 2 decibels. Listen for whether the overhead imaging becomes clearer and adjust from there. For most setups, a small boost of 2 to 3 decibels over the auto-calibrated level makes the overhead layer genuinely obvious without making it sound unnatural or gimmicky. Height speakers should also generally be set to small in your configuration with a crossover around 80 to 120 Hz, allowing the subwoofer to handle bass and letting your height speakers focus entirely on the positional and atmospheric content they're actually designed to reproduce. Setting 5. Use the right Atmos listening mode and disable the things that kill it. The 5th setting is one that catches people who fixed everything else and are still wondering why their Atmos doesn't feel as immersive as it should. It comes down to what listening mode your receiver is actually operating in when you play Atmos content, and whether any post-processing features are interfering with the overhead layer. Your receiver's front panel display is your most reliable indicator of whether real Atmos decoding is happening. When a true Atmos signal is being decoded correctly, the display should explicitly show Dolby Atmos, Dolby True HD plus Atmos, or Dolby Digital plus Atmos depending on the format of your source. If your display shows movie, standard, stereo, or any receiver-branded mode name without explicitly confirming Atmos, there's a good chance your receiver has slipped into a different processing mode that isn't using the Atmos object metadata correctly. This can happen when a sound mode preset that was set for a non-Atmos source gets applied to an Atmos signal. effectively overriding the Atmos decoder with a conventional surround processing algorithm. Make sure when playing Atmos content that your receiver is in a mode that explicitly decodes Atmos, which is usually labeled Dolby Atmos on the display. Many receivers will automatically detect and switch to the correct mode when a proper Atmos bitstream is received. But some require you to either select it manually or at least confirm that auto mode is enabled. If you're in a specific receiver preset like cinema, movie, or a proprietary environment mode, check whether that mode respects and passes through Atmos metadata or applies its own processing on top of it. Processing features that specifically damage the overhead effect include night mode and dynamic range compression, which we've discussed before, and which flatten the dynamic contrasts that make height effects dramatic and noticeable. All-channel stereo and similar upmix modes that spread audio across every speaker can interfere with Atmos object placement by overriding the renderer's calculations with their own distribution logic. Wide stereo or stereo widening modes can distort the front soundstage in ways that confuse the overall spatial picture, even if the height channels themselves are technically active. The general rule is that any processing mode running alongside an Atmos signal that isn't explicitly designed to work with Atmos object metadata should be disabled when watching Atmos content. Use the pure Atmos decode mode without additional processing layers on top. And save upmixing modes like Dolby Surround or DT's Neural X for content that isn't already encoded in Atmos, since those modes are designed to create a height experience from non-Atmos sources rather than to play alongside genuine Atmos decoding. Putting all 5 together and what to expect, when you go through all 5 of these settings systematically, the cumulative effect is not subtle. These aren't marginal tweaks that audio enthusiasts debate in forums. These are fundamental configuration steps that determine whether your height speakers receive real Atmos information, whether your receiver renders it correctly into 3-dimensional space, and whether that rendering is accurate enough in timing, level, and geometry to create genuine overhead imaging. Missing even one of them can collapse the height layer almost completely, which is why so many people with expensive Atmos setups describe the effect as underwhelming or barely noticeable. With all 5 correctly configured, the overhead experience becomes the defining characteristic of your home theater rather than a barely perceptible bonus. Rain sounds like it's falling from above rather than from vaguely somewhere around the front of the room. Aircraft move in a real arc from one side of the space above you to the other rather than just panning from left to right across the front soundstage. Crowd noise, environmental ambience, and musical reverberation fill the space above you with presence and dimension rather than simply filling the room with more surround sound. The room feels acoustically larger, the content feels more cinematic, and you stop noticing the speakers because you're too engaged in the experience they're creating together. Here's the complete checklist to run through right now. First, go into your TV or streaming device and switch audio output from PCM to bitstream or passthrough so real Atmos data actually reaches your receiver. Second, open your receiver's speaker configuration and update the layout to accurately reflect your complete setup, including the correct number of height channels. Third, within that configuration, make sure your height speakers are declared as the correct type, Dolby enabled for up-firing modules, top front or top rear for ceiling speakers so the renderer uses the right geometry. Fourth, measure your actual speaker distances and verify or correct what auto-calibration calculated. And consider boosting your height channel levels by 2 to 3 decibels if the overhead effect feels too subtle. Fifth, confirm your receiver's front panel explicitly shows Dolby Atmos when playing Atmos content, and disable night mode, dynamic compression, and any conflicting processing modes that might be overriding the Atmos decoder. Run through this list tonight, and you'll hear things in your existing setup that you've never heard before. If this video showed you a setting you didn't know you were missing, hit that like button and share it with anyone else who has Atmos but doesn't feel like it's working the way it should. Drop a comment telling me which of these 5 turned out to be the culprit in your own system. I genuinely want to know which one is the most common. And subscribe if you haven't already. because we've got more Atmos guides, calibration deep dives, and home theater setup content coming that will help you keep pushing your system further. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.